So, so this is going to be our section. Next section is talking about seeding and planting. And our goal by the time we finish this 45 minutes is to get what Samuel has here, which is a nice, beautiful crop of something planted. And of course, strawberries are technically fruit, so I probably shouldn't include them in this presentation. But for better or worse, you're getting stuck with that. So here we go. Whoops, what's happening? Okay, so I get a lot of questions oftentimes about ordering seeds and plants in particular. One of the things you're going to find if you get busy in the vegetable garden and start to really enjoy vegetable gardening is that you'll find yourself wanting to grow your own transplants and ordering your own seeds rather than going to the garden centers to do that. And the reality is, and I feel okay saying this, I grew up in the greenhouse business. My parents have a small nursery operation. And I can tell you my experience is most of the nursery and garden centers, they are not very vegetable centric, right? They're very flower focused. They have all the newest, coolest varieties of supertunias and imagination verbena and all that kind of stuff. But they don't necessarily have the new parthenocarpic cucumber, right? Or the Martha Washington hybrid heirloom lookalike tomato, right? Because they just don't sell that many vegetable transplants and they don't want to spend maybe the money on that seed. And so most of us that are really into vegetable gardening end up growing our own transplants so that we can get the varieties that we really want to have in the garden. Or oftentimes we can just buy the seeds and direct sow them. Now, in terms of where you buy your seeds from, the reality, it doesn't matter a whole lot. With hybrid seeds, for example, if you buy a Better Boy tomato, right? Better Boy tomato from Seed Company A is going to be the same as Better Boy tomato from Seed Company B. In fact, it's very likely they probably bought it from the same source. Now, the exception to that is with heirloom varieties. Heirloom varieties are typically produced in a different way than hybrid ones. And so because of that, oftentimes heirloom cultivars that are in one seed company may be slightly different than an heirloom cultivar at another seed company, right? So if you find that perfect Brandywine tomato that you really like from Seed Company A, you might want to just keep going back to Seed Company A to keep getting it. Although you may find it may change even buying it from the same seed company because it's kind of the nature of the way heirlooms are. The other question I get a lot is about certified organic seed. What does that mean and why is it so expensive, right? So what it means is two things. It basically means that seed was produced in a certified organic production setting. So in other words, there were no synthetic fertilizers or pesticides used within the production, of that seed. But I think what's probably more important to you as vegetable gardeners is that it has to do with the seed treatment. So you may or may not know that most of our regular conventional seeds that we buy are treated with fungicides and oftentimes insecticides in order to reduce the chance of damping off and other germination problems and other issues that go along with that seed germinating in the soil. And by and large, it's not a huge issue. They're using very tiny amounts of fungicide and insecticide and making a big impact with those. But I know a lot of Master Gardener groups end up doing sort of volunteer events and have booths at state fairs and other outreach events where you're involving kids. And, I just, as a father myself, I think it's important for all of us to remember that the reason that sweet corn is hot pink is because it has insecticide on it, right? And so we don't want kids handling that and, sticking it in their mouth or putting their fingers in their mouth after they've used that seed. And yourself, if you're using it, then you want to make sure you're washing your hands after you're done sowing that seed. But if you're doing events with kids specifically, you can buy certified organic seed and it won't have any kind of chemical treatment on it. Or you can also buy untreated seed, which is oftentimes a lot less expensive than certified organic seed, and you still get the same result that you want. Now, if you're going to be growing your own transplants, you're going to need a little bit of basic germination equipment. So this is a little rig that I made a few years ago. You can see it's real simple. It's just 3 shop lights attached to a couple 1x2s, hanging on a couple of chains for the lights. And then these are heating mats under here. You do want to make sure you have a thermostat to control those heating mats. If you just plug in a heating mat, it will just cook your plants, right? So you want to make sure it's maintaining the proper temperature. And one of the things that you'll notice about this light setup is that you can see that we've got bulbs next to bulbs next to bulbs. There's no empty space between these light bulbs. Now, these are just standard old-fashioned, I think T12, I always forget, mix it up, cool fluorescent bulbs. So they don't put out a ton of light. So if you're using those types of light bulbs, you really want to make sure you have a bunch of them and that you have a light bulb directly above that germinating seedling so that it doesn't stretch out and elongate. And in fact, if you have an interest in transplant production, we actually just finished a transplant fact sheet through our Growing Growers series that Jason could point you towards if you want to get some more detailed information about growing transplants. Last but not least, don't forget that you can't order seeds too early. The seed companies don't like to tell people this, but don't forget that seed is a biological storage mechanism for those plants, right? So they do actually last a really long time if you treat them well. And what you want to do is basically simulate winter for as long as you can. So we like to keep our seeds in the freezer. That works really well. Or you can keep them in the refrigerator. Anywhere that you can keep them cold and dry is going to maintain the viability for as long as possible. And many of our vegetable plants will last, 5-10 years in the freezer as seeds. And they might lose some viability, but you can always increase, what happens with seed is it loses its germination percentage. It's not like it usually doesn't just stop growing altogether. So you can always plant it a little more thick. Now, the one exception to this is onion seed. Onion seeds do lose their viability pretty quickly, so you will need to order those pretty much every year. So in terms of when to plant, again, it's going to depend if you're talking about cool season or warm season crops. Any warm season crops we want to plant after the last chance of frost or certainly freeze. And around here in Kansas City area, that's usually right around May 1st. It's going to vary a lot depending on the year. It seems like the last few years have been really erratic. I'm not sure if we're going to get any more freezes here in Kansas City in 2016 or not. We'll see. I guess maybe this fall. But spring seems to be coming early around here. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is that the freeze date is really important in terms of protecting the crop from a potential damaging frost or freeze. But in terms of how well that plant's going to grow, that's all driven by soil temperature, right? And soil temperature is really important for plant growth, especially our warm season crops, and especially those that you want to germinate in the garden, things that you're planting seeds in the garden. So it's a good idea to get one of these little soil temperature probes. You can buy them through the seed companies, usually for $7 or $8. They're really inexpensive, and they're real handy to have around both for propagating plants and growing your own transplants, but also for checking the soil temperatures in the spring and in the fall when you start planting those cool season crops and the warm season crops in the early summer as well too. Now, we typically don't like to plant warm season crops until our soil temperatures are about 55 degrees. There's going to be some variation in that. Green beans you can plant with soil temperatures a little bit cooler than that. There's some varieties of sweet corn that need 60-degree soil temperatures to germinate. So you're going to want to look at your seed catalogs and stuff to sort of double check on that. But, again, you're sort of balancing this concept of the last frost-free date with soil temperatures at all time, because there's been some years where we've had 70-degree soil temperatures in March in Kansas, right? Well, you're not going to plant tomatoes outdoors in March. I don't care what year it is. That just sounds like a bad idea. But sometimes, it can be the other way as well too. We can get into the last frost-free period and our soil temperatures are still really cold. But that's happens a lot less often. Typically in a vegetable garden, this is about the one piece of equipment you're really going to want to have. And of course, we all know there's two basic types of tillers, the front tine tiller, right, and then a rear tine tiller. Front tine tillers are typically less expensive. And they're a little bit, well, no, they're not easier to handle. They're a little bit smaller, which can sometimes make them easier to handle. But a front tine tiller is really going to beat you up in the garden. A front tine tiller uses your back as a fulcrum, essentially. And so it can be really hard on your body to use a front tine tiller. Now, once the soil has been broken and the garden is established, it's not usually as bad. But especially if you're cutting in a new garden or trying to cut in sod, I would try and stay away from a front tine tiller, or at least find yourself a 15-year-old kid to do it for you, because that can be considered punishment in a lot of countries. A rear tine tiller is going to put much more of the force back onto the machine, right? And so your job as the operator is to keep it pushed down into the ground and keep it from walking, but it actually does most of the work for you. Now, most rear tine tillers are a fair bit more expensive than a front tine tiller. Front tine tiller is in the neighborhood of $300 or $400. Rear tine tiller, you're talking more like $600 or $700. This is actually a special case. This is called a BCS walk behind tractor, so it's a little bit different, but it would look similar to a rear tine tiller. Now, keep in mind that whether it's a front tine tiller or rear tine tiller, whenever these tines are spinning around, they're going to be fluffing up that top 4 inches of soil and making it nice and soft and easy to manage and plant and seed into. But as it does that, it's also beating the heck out of the lower profiles of soil, because it's got to push off of something in order to flip that soil up, right? And so this is what we call a plow pan or a clay pan that can form in gardens and in agricultural fields because of heavy uses of tillage, right? And so, I think a lot of us are now familiar with many of the benefits of reducing tillage or minimizing tillage. There's a lot of folks out there with an interest now to grow vegetables using no-till systems, kind of similar to people do with corn and soybeans. And there are some no-till systems that work well for vegetables, especially for certain crops. I typically do an advanced training in the fall, every couple of years or so, on no-till vegetable planting. We won't really talk about it today as all, because I don't think it's really appropriate for basic training. But there's a lot of benefits because that tiller is really hard on that soil. And again, it's going to disturb that soil ecosystem, and it's going to cause a lot of compaction. Now, that being said, I am not a person that sort of goes to the never till school. I'm a minimum tillage person myself. So in my garden, I usually will till in the spring when I till in my cover crops, essentially, and plant my spring and summer crops. And then I'll probably till in the fall when I clean up the field and plant my cover crops as well too. So, that's sort of where a good place to start. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of vegetable crops can be sown directly into the garden, right? And I think most of us are fairly familiar with how to do this. This is one of my favorite direct sown crops, baby lettuce. Head lettuce are nice and they look great at the grocery store. But if you're trying to grow lettuce in your own garden, the difficulty with head lettuce is that you wait and wait and wait, and then all of a sudden you have 20 heads of lettuce. So the nice thing about the baby lettuce is that you can go out and cut it. You can cut and come again, essentially, is what we call it, right? So you cut it and it'll re-sprout. You can come back and cut it a couple weeks later. So if you have a decent sized patch, you can sort of take little bits of it out every few days and have fresh salad all through the spring and early summer. Now, most all of your direct sown crops, you're going to want to come back and actually thin the seeds for those. So not all of them, but especially root crops like beets, and I think this is spinach here, but the leafy crops, you probably don't have to do it as much, but any of your root crops like beets and carrots and turnips and some of that kind of stuff, you're going to want to make sure you're thinning so they have the physical room to actually produce those root crops. But you also need to be careful with certain species of sort of above ground crops too. And one of the best examples of this is sweet corn. If you guys remember that picture I showed you earlier from my garden where we had the 2 rows of the tomatoes and then the 3 or 4 rows of sweet corn next to it, I didn't get a single ear of sweet corn out of that garden because I planted my sweet corn too thick. You know, I had beautiful plants that grew, turned green, looked great, but they just were competing with each other so much that they couldn't fill those kernels and make good ears of corn. So it is really important to come back and thin those things, or make sure you're planting them at the right density the first time in order to be sure that you're going to have a good crop. And there's a really nice table actually in your manual, as well as the Kansas Garden Guide, that gives you all the spacing requirements, I think, for almost every vegetable crop. Now, in terms of growing transplants, you know, this is going to be sort of a lot of what capacity you have, if you have the ability to do it. You don't necessarily need a greenhouse to grow your own transplants if you can be a little bit creative. But what you will need is sort of a germination chamber or a lit chamber. And a lot of times people will put these in their basement or their garage. And then you're going to want to have some type of a cold frame. And I'll show you a picture of a cold frame here in a few minutes. A place where you can allow those plants to get full sun but still have protection from the cold wind and things like that. So, you know, you're going to need those two basic pieces of equipment. And you're also going to need time. Don't forget that little seedlings on heating mats dry out very quickly. So you got to be able to water those things often. And, you know, you can't run off to the lake for the weekend, that kind of thing. Or if you do, you need somebody to be able to watch over those plants just like they do the cats and the dogs. So this is a broccoli transplant here. And broccoli, like most of the brassicas, have really sensitive roots to damage or to transplanting. So in this case, what we actually do is we sow the seed directly in this pot. And this is, you know, like a Jiffy pot or a peat pot, I should say, or a biodegradable pot. And what we'll do is we can actually put 2 seeds in that pot, you know, cover it with about a 1/4 inch of soil to keep it nice and dark and keep the moisture good. And then after they germinate, we'll thin it down to 1 plant. And then it'll grow in this biodegradable pot, and we can plant that biodegradable pot right in the soil, and we never have to touch the root system of that plant. And brassicas and broccoli in particular really appreciate that because they don't like having the roots handled very much. And in general, you're going to want to direct sow you're going to want to direct sow those seeds into whatever finished, you know, pot it is, whether it's a transplant plug or a biodegradable pot or something else. You're probably going to want to just directly sow those seeds right into it for broccoli and other brassicas. But a lot of plants will actually sow into trays and then transplant them into the pots. And I'll show you an example of that here in just a minute. Most of our vegetable crops take anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks, but there's a lot of variation there. Cucurbits take more like 3 to 4 weeks. A tomato is going to take about 6 weeks. Pepper plant's going to take more like 8 weeks. So one of the things that you're going to want to do is, you know, I know it's tempting for me, especially this time of year, we start getting sunny days. We get our seeds in from the seed company. We just want to go out there and plant them all, right? But keep in mind, you want to have all these things ready right around the 1st of May or whenever your frost-free date is, your anticipated planting date. So you really want to get your calendar out, you know, set the schedule for that planting date, and then find out how many days it takes to get to the transplant size you want and work backwards. And what should end up happening is about 8 weeks from planting, you'll plant your peppers. 6 weeks will be your tomatoes and eggplants and some of those other guys. 4 weeks will be your cucurbits. If you're going to do okra and transplants, you can do it at that time too. So there's a specific schedule, and you kind of want to stick to that so you don't end up with these really large, leggy plants that are overly big for planting. So some of the advantages and disadvantages, again, the big advantage is that you get exactly what you want when you want, right? As I mentioned before, oftentimes it's really hard to find the new cool varieties of tomatoes and cucumbers at the local garden centers. So this makes it really easy to get the variety that you want. The other thing that I really like about growing your own transplants is, again, anytime you bring soil onto your property, whether it's in the vegetable garden or your ornamental garden or your turf and landscape, anytime that you bring soil, whether it's in the form of compost or whether it's in the pot of a nursery or tree, plant, or whether it's in the pot of a vegetable transplant, there is some chance that you can bring weed seeds, insect eggs, all that kind of stuff with it. So by growing your own transplants, you really build this little moat around your little garden space, right? And you help reduce the chances of bringing some of those bad guys in. Now there are, some cons as well too. We already sort of discussed the equipment and time that it takes. The other thing that I've found in my experiences as a homeowner or home gardener is that potting mix can be kind of difficult. So potting mix, most potting mixes are based from a material called peat or coir, right? And that's sort of the brown stuff in the potting mix that holds most of the water and interacts with the roots the most. Now, what you may or may not know is that both peat and coir don't really stick to water. In fact, trying to get them to stick to each other is like mixing oil and water. And so they use these products known as wetting agents, which are basically surfactants or soaps that they spray onto the peat and the coir, and it allows that water to stick to the wetting agent, which is then stuck to the peat. Right, and once you get that peat wet the first time, then it's fine. From that point on, the water sticks to the water that's already there, right? But getting it wet the first time requires this product known as what's called a wetting agent that's commonly used in all potting mixes. Now, the reason this is important for you is, unfortunately, if potting mix is not stored properly, that wetting agent can go bad really quickly. And I've seen this happen a lot. You get pallets of soil that get wet and dry and cold and warm and wet and dry. A lot of these extreme weather conditions, the wetting agent can go bad really quickly. And this, at least in my experiences, happens very often if you're buying soil, from some of the big box stores and stuff like that, because they don't know what they're doing by storing that soil improperly. They just put it out in the parking lot, with everything else. So a good way to avoid this is, first of all, buy your potting mix from people that use potting mix. If you go to a local garden center or nursery where they're actually transplanting and growing their own plants, then they're going to know how to store that potting mix correctly so this doesn't happen. And B, they're most likely pulling potting mix for you out of their own inventory that they're already storing properly so that doesn't happen. So that's a nice way to avoid that problem. The other thing you can do is, if you do end up with potting mix where the wetting agent has gone bad, you can actually rehydrate it. So I don't know if you guys have ever had this experience before, but essentially what happens is you can fill a tray like this with potting mix, and then you water it down, and the potting mix floats away, essentially is what it looks like. The peat kind of floats up to the top and just floats right out of the tray. And the peat won't get wet. It literally looks like it's trying to mix oil and water. So if you take it out of this plug tray and put that potting mix into a big bulk container, like a Rubbermaid tub or something like that, and you can actually spray it with water, and you kind of spray it with water, mix it up, spray it with water, mix it up, and do that a few times, and it will eventually absorb that water. It just takes a little bit of elbow grease to get there. So you can revive that. But if you have bags of potting mix that sit in the garage, all summer and all fall, don't expect them to work again in the spring, because by then that wetting agent will have gone bad. So with a lot of crops, we will actually sow the seeds directly into what we would call seedling trays. Right, and then when they start to develop their first true leaf, we'll go ahead and transplant them into a plug tray or a pot. Right, so these are pepper plants being transplanted, and you can see the growth stage. They don't quite have a true leaf on them. You'll find the more experienced transplanter become the smaller the transplant you can do. But it's a good rule of thumb is to wait until that first true leaf forms. Now these tomatoes, I would probably transplant these tomatoes. They're ready for that. And we'll often germinate tomatoes in seedling trays. And then what you can do is you can just take like a Sharpie marker or a small stick and just kind of put it in down through the side. And what your goal is to sort of rip away a chunk of this seedling mat. And then when you separate the plants, you want to separate them from the side. You don't want to put your hand in there and pull up, because if you pull up, the stem is just going to break. But if you can get that hole or a chunk of that soil out of that container and be able to pull the plants to the side, they'll actually come apart really easily, and then you can just transplant them into a new plug. Now, one of the real advantages about germinating things in seedling trays is it allows you to use a lot less space in a germination chamber. You know, if you were to take this many tomato plants and germinate them in like a 50-cell propagation tray, it would take almost 10 times as much space to do that, right? And so if all you have is a couple small heating mats, you know, a lot of people like to germinate things in really small containers like this and then transplant them up to a plug tray or something like that. These are what are called row trays. So they actually sell trays now that have essentially rows in them for seeding like this. These are onion seedlings here. And they work really nicely, especially for home gardeners, because, you know, as opposed to this, you may not have a variety of tomato where you want to germinate this many seeds. But these row trays, because they're compartmentalized, you know, you can just plant 10 seeds or 15 seeds in that row real easily, and it'll keep it all separated for you. This is what we call a propagation tray. So, you know, this is a 50-cell plug tray. It's a similar size to the things that you would buy at the store. Now, you can transplant directly into these plug trays, or in this picture, what we're doing is we're direct sowing, right? So I mentioned before, there's several families of crops that really don't like to be transplanted very much. And I mentioned the brassicas already. But also the cucurbits are definitely in this family. You would never want to transplant a cucurbit in the same way that we can tomatoes and eggplants and peppers. So in those cases, what we'll do is actually plant the seed straight into its final pot or final container, really. Now, the traditional way was always to sort of put, you know, like 2 seeds in this plug, let them germinate, and let them grow for a few days, and then thin it down to 1 plant. To me, a lot of times seed is becoming a lot more expensive per seed these days, especially with a lot of the new hybrids that are coming out. And because of that, the germination rates seem to be getting better. So for me, a lot of times if I'm buying expensive, especially like tomato seed, or if I don't have a lot of seed, there's no problem with just putting 1 seed in there. You may end up with an empty plug cell, you know, every once in a while, but it's not a big deal if you're not trying to sell those, right? You do want to make sure that you're covering that seed back up with soil. Pretty much all of our vegetable plants that I know of, at least, need to be covered with soil because they need dark to germinate. Now, once those plants have germinated, you want to get them into as much light as quickly as possible. And one of the sort of common mistakes I see with a lot of folks that are new to growing their own transplants is they just totally overestimate the amount of light that comes out of those small fluorescent bulbs. You know, fluorescent light bulbs put 1/1000th of the light as the sun. So we want to get them out into the full sun as quickly as possible. And one of the easiest ways to do this is by building a small cold frame. And this isn't a small cold frame. This is a really pretty nice one here. You can see the sidewalls are about 18 inches in the front and about 24 inches in the back. And so those sidewalls are going to keep the sun off of the plants. It's also going to keep a little bit of those rays coming in from this way as well. Sorry, I shouldn't have said sun. I meant to say wind. And then what we'll do with this cold frame is, you know, really without stressing the plants, I'd like to keep it open as much as possible. But the reality is, especially when you have cool days and those 30s and 40 degree days, you want to have this probably vented so that it's able to accumulate some heat, but also allow some heat to escape. And then at night, you can close these doors, right? And so that's going to keep the frost off of the plants. And it's also going to trap a little bit of heat in here as well, too. Now, one of the things to not forget is this is not a greenhouse. This is just a cold frame. So if it's going to be a really cold night, if it's going to be below freezing is what they're expecting, you probably want to go ahead and just move those plants into a garage or some type of heated area to get through the night. It will hold some heat, but you'll want to determine what that is by, checking a thermometer in the middle of the night and that kind of stuff before you risk putting your plants in there. This is what's known as the world's cheapest cold frame here. It's basically some weed fabric laying on the ground. And then this is what's called floating row cover. And we're going to talk a lot more about floating row cover in the next couple sessions this afternoon. But it's basically a spun bonded polyester fabric that essentially works like a frost blanket. So during the nighttime, you can basically cover these plants up with this blanket, and it's going to allow frost, it's going to prevent frost from settling on the plants and causing damage. You may or may not know that frost, it's typically the thing that causes the problem on plants, especially cool season crops, is not actually the temperatures that the frost occurs at. It's actually the physical interaction of the frost with the leaves, especially when it melts early in the morning. So like when I was a kid working in the greenhouse, we would have to go out and wash the frost off of our plants, before the sun would come up, because when the sun hits those plants and they have frost on them, that actually does as much damage to the leaves as anything. Last but not least, before we finish transplants, I did just want to mention real quickly, I also usually do an advanced Master Gardener training, again, about every other year or so, on grafting. So you may or may not know that there's a lot of people getting interested in grafting vegetables, just like we do apple trees and grapevines and stuff like that. And in this case, what we do is we actually graft sort of your favorite tomato onto what are called interspecific hybrid rootstocks. And those are rootstocks that are a cross between a wild and a domestic species. And because of that, oftentimes they have increased vigor, so they can increase the yield by anywhere from 20 to 60%, depending on the rootstock. And they can also increase their ability to resist diseases. So many of these rootstocks are resistant to diseases that, especially like heirlooms and some of our other tomatoes, are not resistant to. And so we can simply graft those plants onto a resistant rootstock to manage diseases. So we actually do a lot of work in my research group on this area. In fact, I have a graduate student defending her thesis this coming Monday, so we're very excited about that. And so we do research both in evaluating rootstocks for tomatoes, but also looking at different propagation methods for grafted tomatoes as well. So I'm not really going to get into the details of how that works, but I just want to let you know what's going on and show you a couple pictures. This is the size of the plant when it typically gets grafted, and this would be the rootstock here. And you can see we want to graft below the seed leaves, or what's called the cotyledon leaves of the rootstock. And we use these small silicone clips that actually hold together the rootstock and the scion while that graft union fuses. So you can see this is the scion being inserted down into that clip. Nice parallel lines so that these guys match up real nice and tight, right? And then that graft union is going to fuse over the next 7 to 9 days inside what we call a healing chamber. So we essentially just trick the plants into staying alive without a root system while that graft union fuses. Plants are much cooler than people because they're able to do this. If I cut my arm off and cut my brother's arm off and we stuck them together, they probably wouldn't grow together, right? But with tomatoes, you can do that. Okay, so once you've grown your transplants, and it's time to go ahead and set them into the garden. And you want to do this in a way that really reduces transplant shock, right? And I haven't mentioned it yet, but one of the best ways to reduce transplant shock is by growing a really nice, hardy, well-hardened transplant. So once you start to use that cold frame, you're going to want to acclimate that plant to, the brutal environment known as Kansas, right? And so you're going to want to find ways to expose that plant to some wind, but not so much that it's damaging, so that it can kind of stiffen up its tissue and become ready for planting out into the garden, right? Now, once it's time to planting day hits, you want to make sure those plants are not water stressed or not nutrient stressed. It's always a good idea to get a nice wet root ball before you start putting them into the ground. Oftentimes they will still wilt after you put them into the ground because the plants just go through some stress. It's also a good idea to use some starter fertilizer. A lot of us like to use water-soluble fertilizer for this. You can also use, if you're an organic gardener, you can use fish emulsion fertilizers and some of those others as well. One thing I would recommend, especially if you're using water-soluble synthetic fertilizers like Miracle-Gro and that kind of stuff, is wait. For me at least, when I work in the garden, when I plant, I typically till and make my beds and put down my mulch and plant pretty much all on the same day, right? Which means the soil is going to be relatively dry because we never want to till soil when it's real wet. And I didn't make a point of saying that earlier, but it is important to keep this in mind, that if you're tilling wet soil, you're going to have heavily compacted soil real soon. So typically on planting day for me, the soil conditions are fairly dry. And so what I'll do is I'll actually just soak the beds real nice and heavy with clear water, and then come back the next day and add my water-soluble fertilizer. And what that's going to do for you is it's going to make sure to ensure that you've done a nice job of getting those beds nice and wet after you've planted, but also prevents you from over-fertilizing or possibly putting fertilizer in the garden that's never going to get used by the plant because you're not trying to re-wet the garden with fertilizer water. I'm a big fan of using raised beds as well. Now, you really don't have to use them, and certainly for all crops you don't have to use them. But there are certain ones that really do like it. Now, I know this is the vegetable training session, but strawberries, they tend to get put into the garden with the rest of the vegetables, so we're including them here. Strawberries are a crop that almost have to be on raised beds. They really are susceptible to a lot of root rot pathogens, and so it's really important to have them on raised beds, and it's going to help them grow and do better in the fall and the spring as well, because it's going to help warm that soil, and especially if you're using plastic or fabric mulches, it's going to help warm that soil even further, right? Now, at the research station, we have big machines that make raised beds for these. This is my garden here. And you can see I did this basically with an iron rake and a hoe. And it's not particular, well, I don't know. I guess it's kind of fun work. It's very gratifying when you're done, you put it that way. But it is a fair amount of work to make a handmade raised bed. This is what we would call a permanent raised beds, right, where we put in landscape timbers or some type of lumber and actually build up the frame of the garden and fill it in with compost and topsoil. And the nice thing about doing this is you can basically go into an area that has horrible soil and have an instant garden, because you're able to add enough soil that the plant should still thrive and do well. The big disadvantage with these things or con is just that they're so bloody expensive. I think there's probably a lot of raised beds that get put in the U.S. and across the country that don't necessarily need to be there. We have relatively good soil here in Kansas and in the Midwest. I know there's lots of people out there that would argue with me on that, but if you've ever lived in the South, you know that we really do have very good soil here. And so oftentimes people go a little bit overboard with the raised beds. This would be a good example of that. But this picture was taken in North Carolina, so they have very terrible soil there. Now, this was a garden that I was managing at the time, and we had a crop rotation in place. So just to give you an example of what we did, this was zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4 was here, 5, 6, 7, 8. And you can't really see 8, but that kind of gives you a feeling for how I was managing crop rotation in that particular situation. So, if you don't want to buy these really, really high dollar landscape timbers, the other thing you can do is you can just make a raised bed out of a pile of dirt, right? So this is a picture actually at our Master Gardener demonstration garden here at the research station in Olathe. And this is one of the things they've done. They've done a really nice job of actually bringing in soil and making raised beds, but they're not necessarily enclosed raised beds with lumber. Although they do have those as well too. Both of these pictures were taken from that demonstration garden. And you get all the same benefit in this raised bed that you do here, except it costs a heck of a lot less, right? So just something to keep in mind for the future. I'm also a big fan of using mulches. I really think this is important, not only to help control weeds, but especially to conserve soil moisture. And it's amazing the differences that this stuff makes, especially plastic and fabric mulches. They really hold a lot of soil moisture in. And I know a lot of people don't like to use plastic in their garden, but you'd be amazed how much better water retention you're going to have. And again, this is a nice organically approved method of weed control as well too, because most weeds are not going to be able to germinate and poke their way through that plastic or through that fabric. Now, if you don't want to use plastic or fabric, there's a lot of biodegradable mulches, or what I have listed here is organic mulches. Straw is probably a really common one. You're in a nice part of the state to be able to have good availability for wheat straw. We don't really have great availability here on the eastern side of the state. Even when we can buy it, it's very, very, very expensive. But one of the things I really like to use is actually leaves as mulch. And if you can find a source of leaves, or if you're working in a community garden where you can have landscapers actually drop off leaves in the fall, boy, it's a great source of biodegradable mulch and can really help improve the soil health. So this is actually out at my family's property in my dad's garden. These are some sweet potatoes here. If you haven't grown sweet potatoes in the Midwest, they really love our hot, dry summers that we have. And they do really well in this part of the country. And what we'll do is we'll actually go and get the leaves in the fall and collect them and put them into a great big pile. And they just sit there and hang out in the corner of the yard all through the winter. And then in the spring, we'll actually spread them out into the garden. And it's kind of like paper mache at this point. You can see it's kind of a mishmash of leaves and other things. And we'll put it on fairly thick, about 4 to 6 inches thick. And what that's going to do is make a really nice mat to prevent the weeds from coming up through it. And then we'll use it as a mulch all through the year. And then in the fall, you can basically till that in. And it's a really beautiful source of organic material for the soil. And it's a nice, actually, sort of alternative to cover crops as well, too. If you think about leaves, for the most part, they're not going to have very many weed seeds in them, or they shouldn't. They shouldn't really have any pathogen spores in there. There's, I suppose some chance there's maybe a fungicide in there, but I really doubt it. Leaves in general are fairly clean. If you think about what goes into a bag of leaves or onto that leaf truck. So they can be a really nice source of organic material that's relatively reduced risk. I'm also a big fan of using fabric mulch. So that's what this is here. These are some heirloom tomatoes growing. You can buy fabric mulch at many of the horticulture supply centers, and they use it, really it was designed and marketed for the landscape industry and to put around trees and shrubs and that kind of stuff. But it really works great for vegetables, especially in small plantings like in home gardens and also in high tunnels, which is what this is a picture of. And the thing that's great about fabric mulch is it's really tough. As opposed to plastic, fabric can be reused year after year after year. And you can buy fabric mulch that then lasts as many as 15, if not more years. And so you can reuse it, which is nice from a sustainability standpoint. The other thing that's really nice about it is that I don't know anything that can come up through fabric mulch. Nut sedge can come up through plastic. It will come up through leaves and newspaper and cardboard and anything you throw at it, but it will not come up through fabric mulch. It's really tough stuff. So you have to do a little bit of weeding in the holes where the plant's coming out. But other than that, you really don't have to do any weeding. So this is the fun part about using fabric mulch. And we use actually a lot of fabric mulch at the research station, especially for our high tunnel plantings, but outdoors as well too. And we actually will burn holes into the fabric mulch as opposed to cutting holes. You know, the logical side of me is because it prevents the fraying and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is just kind of fun to burn holes into fabrics. So it's a good way to keep the student workers moving and motivated. Hand them a torch and see what happens. But you do want to be a little bit careful. One time when I was a young man, I burned a bunch of fabric over a field that kind of looked like this. It was actually a wheat stubble field, and I lit that field on fire. So you know, you certainly want to be careful anytime you're using a torch. You do want to wear a pair of shoes with thick soles on them because every now and again you got to stomp the fire out too.